us so early. Well, 10 a.m. It's early for me on a Thursday morning. You're joining us for our webinar on neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is not an afterthought, making our workplaces work for our neurodivergent employees. Welcome, get comfortable. We're going to spend about an hour talking this morning, and you're going to be very much a part of that as well. Let me first, before we do intros, just very quickly share with you how this webinar is set up and the different ways that you can engage with it. So the first thing to share is we have closed captioning on this webinar. If you want to access closed captioning, you can go down to the bottom bar, go to more, and then click on that and go to show subtitle. And you'll be able to have closed captioning for the whole of this webinar. As I said already, but if you've just joined us, because I know lots of you are coming in at the moment, this is going to be recorded. So if there's anything you miss in the moment or you want to come back to, don't worry at all. You'll be able to do that. You'll have access to a recorded version of this webinar after we've finished. Maybe not immediately after, give it a few hours, but it will be going up as well. Also, I just want to share with everybody that we're using very minimal visual stimuli for this webinar. There's very little in terms of slides that we're using. I think it's about one slide, isn't there, Ruby? And we will be describing the slide verbally as well. So if you prefer to engage with this without, you might turn off the screen and just listen to it. That is absolutely fine. You won't miss anything in that mode of engagement. And finally, just to share with everybody that if myself and Ruby at any point during this webinar going too fast, we're moving really, really quickly through some content, or you just like a little bit more of an explanation, then you can share that with us via the Q&A function. Again, go to the bottom bar, click on more and go to Q&A, or you may have the Q&A already on your bottom bar, and you can then submit as a question just for us, asking us to slow down or re-explain something for you, and we'll try our very best to do so. Okay, still getting lots of you coming this morning. I don't think I've seen this number of attendees, Ruby, for a webinar on a Thursday morning before. I think it's something about the weather. I'm not going to take any personal credit. The weather is beautiful this morning. Folks, if you haven't met me before, seen me on the internet before, my name's Sarah Shavesi, and I'm Chief Learning Officer globally at Fearless Futures, and my pronouns are she and her. This morning's webinar, I'll be in discussion with our amazing Director of Consultancy, Ruby Clark, pronouns also she and her. Welcome, Ruby, to this webinar.
Thank you, Sarah, and so wonderful to see so many people joining us. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here to dig in with you.
Amazing. And because you're about 10 minutes away from me, I'm going to make the assumption that you've also got this absolutely glorious weather. Folks,
blue skies and warm.
So nice, isn't it? I just want to share with you folks that when I look out my window, there is so much blossom as well. Blossom against a blue sky is everything. I hope that those joining us, you're not like, Sarah, please be quiet. It is raining wherever I am. I hope this weather is where you are as well. Okay, so this morning we're going to be talking about neurodiversity and neurodivergence. I have no doubt that in your organisation, in your sector, you've started to hear dialogues around neurodiversity, which is so exciting and a long time coming as well. At Fearless Futures, we're really committed to ensuring that these dialogues actually create real change. So that's what today's all about. Myself and Ruby are going to be in discussion, talking about neurodiversity and neurodivergence, and critically moving us into a space of what we can do to create workplaces that work for our neurodivergent colleagues, building equity and inclusion to break down the barriers that they are facing every day. We're going to be in discussion for some of this, but we also want you to get involved. There's so many of you that we want to hear your voices. So if you have a question for us, please do pop it in the Q&A function. Again, I'm going to say that's at the bottom bar. You can click on the Q&A function and share a question for us. And we will try and cover as many of them as possible when we get to the Q&A at the end of the session. If your question is left over at the end, send it to us via email. You never know, we might be able to ping an answer back to you, but we'll try and cover as much as possible in this time we have together. I want to just share with you all that I think the best thing for us to do whenever we're talking about an area of DEI, whenever we're talking about an area of anti-oppression, is to zoom out, to zoom in again. We say consistently at Fearless Futures, you can't solve for a problem unless you truly understand it. So that's where I want to start today. I want to start and zoom out. But don't worry, folks, myself and Ruby are committed to zooming in today to give you some really concrete do-nows as well. So do stick around for those. Ruby, I'd love for us to start in that space then. What does neurodiversity mean? Because as I said, we can't solve something unless we truly understand it. And actually, when we look at the literature on neurodiversity, I mean, this phrase itself was only coined in the 90s. The conversation around this is extremely new, although the lived experience is not. Can you talk us through what neurodiversity means and how we should understand that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And you're spot on. The terminology, the term neurodiversity was coined in the 1990s by autistic scholar Judy Singer as an alternative to language that was used at the time, which was more rooted in an idea of deficit. And today we sometimes notice that there can be a sort of interchanging of neurodiversity with neurodivergence and other terms of phrase. So I think it's a good idea for us to kind of start with some definitions and understanding the distinctions between the two terms that I mentioned and where they come from. So I'm going to share a slide just as I speak through these definitions. So Sorry, you give me a thumbs up to let me know that you can see my slide. Okay, so I was giving you a thumbs up. Happy days. So neurodiversity, first and foremost, really speaks to the fact of diversity of human minds, human neurology. There is no singular brain or mind of way of being. And neurodivergence then describes people whose mind, body, or neurology diverges not from a pre-existing or essential normal, but rather from the social ideas of what a normal mind, body, or neurology is. And so then we have the term neurotypical in place of perhaps normal, which is often used. Neurotypical is a term that describes people whose mind, body, or neurology, their disposition is in line with what is socially and culturally valued in society, what's accepted, what's prioritized, the ideas of what is normal. And it's really important that we use the language of neurotypical to describe those folks, to move away from this idea that there is a given binary, right? That there is a normal and perhaps abnormal mind body. These phrases, these terms, I should say, come from the neurodiversity paradigm. What is the neurodiversity paradigm? So the neurodiversity paradigm is a paradigm we use that moves us away from a different paradigm, a very common paradigm, which is the pathology paradigm. The pathology paradigm says there is a singular, normal, healthy brain and an abnormal, unhealthy brain. This is the binary that I was talking about. And on that basis, there's an idea that people with abnormal brains have something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. Now, moving away from that, we have instead the neurodiversity paradigm that recognizes there is no such thing as a normal brain, mind, or body. Variation in neurology, that neurodiversity is completely natural. None is more wrong than the other. And within that paradigm, then we have these terms that are really useful for us: neurodivergence and neurotypicality, or to be neurotypical.
Gosh, okay, you've given us so much richness there, Ruby. Thank you so much. And I think that is something we see a lot in organizations, is perhaps using language in ways that changes, so isn't quite precise, or using things as synonymous that are not synonymous. For example, as you said, neurodiversity and neurodivergence, using them interchangeably when actually they mean something very different. And I really like how you've underlined for us this idea that actually neurodiversity is something that's much broader and something that applies always, all the time, in any group of people. You know, there is always that diversity of the ways in which our bodies and minds operate. These are our definitions, and we know definitions are really, really important for us all to be in the same place. And I want to start with that as we start to zoom in, Ruby, into the doing. How do we build cultures and policies and processes in our organizations that break down barriers for our neurodivergent colleagues? So I want to zoom in on this and really think about what are the paradigms, what are the approaches and tactics at a broad overarching level that we should be taking, or more simply, what are the starting points? What are our starting points always? And when you were talking there, the thing that jumped out at me is the social model of disability.
Right.
The need to employ the social model of disability as our starting point in our workplaces in reference to creating equity and inclusion for our neurodivergent colleagues. And just very quickly, I've just got a caveat to say, when I'm talking about disability here, I want us all to be really clear that not all neurodivergent folks understand their neurodivergence as a disability. So you have to be really careful there. Not everybody does. And that's okay. That is totally valid. But the reason why I want us to talk about the social model of disability is because I think it's really useful as our starting point in our organizations and can be really well applied to neurodivergence. Really quickly, in case you've never come across the social model of disability before, let me just give you a quick explainer. This is a simplification, of course. There's going to be some things missing from this, but essentially, within disability activism and studies, there's been historically kind of two different ways of thinking about disability. One of them is the individual model. The individual model of disability positions the disability as in the body or the mind of the person. So the disability is because a person has an impairment. The social model of disability, and this is the one I want us to pivot into, positions the disability as in society, that somebody is disabled by the design of society. Therefore, the responsibility for change is with society. Let me give you an example. If we look at somebody, for example, that is in a wheelchair, the individual model of disability states that they are disabled by their own body and their lack of mobility, for example. But the social model, and this is where we really want to go with this, positions that disability in society, that person is disabled by society, by the lack of dropped curbs, by the lack of working lifts in all buildings, by the lack of ramps everywhere. If those things were in place, that disability would be reduced and we could move towards a world where people weren't disabled in the same way. Why does this matter when we're talking about neurodivergence? Well, for me, this is the starting point. Rather than starting from a place of, there are some people in our workplace that have particular conditions, however they might describe their neurodivergence. Instead, what we're saying is our workplace itself is designed in a way that disadvantages certain people. start from there, we take the responsibility away from individual people and put it on us as a workplace. We interrogate, what are we doing that is disadvantaging neurodivergent folks every day, or prioritizing neurotypical folks every day? So we might look at our recruitment process. What are all the points in the recruitment process that we are creating barriers to neurodivergent folks? Our onboarding process, the way we run our meetings. For me, the number one first approach we have to take when it comes to building equity for our neurodivergent colleagues is we need to position the conversation, whatever we're doing, in the space of the disabling factors or the disadvantaging factors are with us. Therefore, we need to seek to solve them and change them, not the problem is with them and the way their mind or body works. That's a psychological, a mental model shift that we need to start with. That has to be our starting point. So for me, that's the paradigm we really need to start in. Tactically then, Ruby, where do we go with that? So we start in that place. We understand we have to be the ones that are looking at how our workplace operates. What do we do next?
Thank you so much, Sarah. As you were speaking, I had like a light bulb moment where the mapping of the social model versus the individual model, we can see, right, how the pathological model that I spoke to and the neurodiversity model are also corresponding to those broader ways of approaching disability and anti-disablism. So I wanted to share my light bulb moment. Maybe others had already had that. The question you asked, Sarah, was, once we have these paradigms, these kind of models and frameworks for how we approach creating change and solutions, where do we go? What do we do to build equity for neurodivergent colleagues? A very important question. So for me, I think there's two key things that we can do that I want to kind of uplift and underline. The first is to say that what we often see in organizations is a tendency to default to thinking about particular neurodivergencies, conditions, or experiences. That's if we are thinking about neurodivergence at all, right? And if we are, that's great, but we do tend to see it's more common perhaps to be thinking about ADHD or perhaps autism than Tourette syndrome or borderline personality disorder, right? There's certain neurodivergencies that kind of get defaulted in our solutioning. And to really create equity for folks who are neurodivergent, we need to be expansive and inclusive in who we are thinking about when it comes to redesigning that recruitment policy or planning that event. And so one of the things that I'd suggest for folks who are listening today is to start with a framework like a neurodivergent umbrella framework, something that I've seen be really, really useful as that starting point, as a framework to use. So I'm going to bring up a visual example, and I'll talk through it. So on the screen, I'm sharing an image. It's a colorful image with an umbrella in the center. Neurodivergent umbrella is the label written on there. And underneath, we have a list of various neurodivergencies and conditions. For example, we have ADHD, NPD, CPSD, sensory processing disorder, dyscalculia, tic disorders, Down syndrome, epilepsy. Many of these are very rarely included in our solutioning for neurodivergent colleagues. And so how do we go about using something like a neurodivergent umbrella? Well, you can either use one, there's many versions out there. This one is from the Lived Experience Educator, who's a wonderful advocate, disability advocate, who I really recommend you check out. Or you can go ahead and create an even more detailed one so that when it comes to planning that event, you can sit down and go, okay, who are we not thinking about? Where is there an intersection in perhaps solutions that will work for some folks? What other solutions do we need that we haven't thought about? So that's the first thing that I would suggest, is expand your understanding of who you need to be thinking about, right? Secondly, I'm going to stop screen sharing now. Secondly, I would say, you might be listening to Sarah and I speak and having heard me name some of those neurodivergencies, or perhaps you looked at the visual, you might be thinking, there is a lot of specificity here, and there is a real range of folks that I need and experiences that I need and want to be considering and solutioning for. And I feel overwhelmed, right? And that's okay. I understand that, especially if you're thinking at the level of structural change. If you're thinking, how am I going to create a recruitment policy that is truly equitable across neurodivergent experiences? And what I would say is, I really encourage people to seek consultation from experts, whether that is internal expertise or external expertise. And I really want to underline that, especially where that pathological model is in place, that individual broader model of disability, there can be this sometimes implicit belief that neurodivergent folks can't themselves know what their needs are, right? And the solutions that perhaps a really large organization or company needs to put in place, that ADHD person couldn't possibly know the solutions. So I'd invite us to challenge who we're seeking expertise from and to disrupt that thinking where it may be playing out. Whether you use an internal consultant or an external consultant, please, of course, remember that this is labor. It's not the job of neurodivergent folks to give us the solutions for free, right? And so please make sure that you are compensating folks, either your internal or external consultants, fairly for their time. They're my two top suggestions: expansive understanding of neurodivergence, and seek consultation where you feel like you need more expertise.
I really appreciate you bringing in that expansiveness and showing us that slide. You showed me that slide before, and I really appreciate the reminder always. It's like any marginalization, any inequity, we can sometimes fall into the trap of this limited idea, can't we, that it's just these people because that's who we immediately think of, or perhaps who we have a relationship with or know of. But we need to broaden that. There is, and what I'm really hearing from you, and I think this is really profound, there is no single neurodivergent experience. There is no single, and we need to make that as pluralistic as possible. Who are we not thinking of and why? And really ensuring, and I love that umbrella, and credit where it's due to the creator of that, because I do think something you can just, as a leader like myself, just come back to again and again and again. Who am I not thinking about today? Who do I want to center in my thinking? So firstly, starting in the social model is, I'm just summarizing here for us all, starting in the social model is a really important space, starting from the space of what are we doing and how do we need to change our behavior, all of us in the workplace, rather than who are they, what's their problem. So starting in that space, and then moving into, and I love where you've taken us with this, Ruby, taking a really pluralistic, a really wide understanding of neurodivergence, avoiding making neurodivergent synonymous with just one particular way of being, and also consultation. Amplify voices, make sure if there's things we don't understand, that is totally fine. None of us can be experts in everything. Seek out that expertise from people that can support us in it. That's our wide starting point. Let's get razor sharp. Let's get into it. Do now. You've got that as your starting point. Do now. And before I just go into, before I pass over to Ruby on this, I just want to say, I know messages come into the Q&A that I think maybe some of you struggled to hear me. From here on in, I am going to position myself very close to my microphone, so hopefully that helps, but do give me a message if that continues. Over to you, Ruby. Do now. Give us some things to get going today, tomorrow.
Thank you, Sarah. So using the social model, using, if it feels useful for you, this expansive understanding like an umbrella framework, and consultation where you need it. I think the thing that I want to start with in this space of real practicality is emphasizing that we need both tailored solutions, personalized solutions, and flexibility to anchor into the way we're designing equity. I think they need to be our kind of guiding stars, if you like. So when I talk about flexibility, I'm thinking about solutions around work schedules, around work locations. Do we need to be in an office at all? Things like telecommunication options, right? The software that we use, support for certain sensory needs, like noise cancelling headphones, or the use of grayscale documents, right? Tailored, personalized solutions are necessary to ensure that what we are creating are the conditions in our workplaces that enable people to do their job in a way that prioritizes their well-being and ensures they're set up for success, right? We can't just create a policy for quote unquote neurodivergent colleagues, right? It's not possible to do that because each person will have specific needs. And so we need personalized solutions and we need flexibility. Often there can be this kind of culture in our organizations of this is the way we do things. This is how it's always been done. We can't suddenly start bringing the use of grayscale documents because that's not marketing friendly. And actually, if we are committed to creating equity for our neurodivergent colleagues, we really need to be ready to challenge ourselves around thinking, why is that the way it's always been done? Why is that being prioritized and at what cost? Now, I want to offer something. This is a policy and process that really can support us to go about the process of creating tailored and personalized solutions with that flexibility I mentioned. Often, when we go about creating solutions that are personalized and tailored, it's very ad hoc to the extent that maybe it doesn't kind of become a process in our organization. I hope that distinction makes sense because I am saying it needs to be ad hoc if it's personalized, but if it's not really a process that's embedded in how we do things at our organization, maybe certain people aren't getting the opportunity, aren't being prioritized to have solutions that work for them. So one of the most scalable and effective policies that I think organizations of any size in any sector can put in place today is something called we call it a Work With Me guide at Fearless Futures. A Work With Me guide is a personal sort of user's manual, if you like, that really, it's a document that we can write ourselves. We would suggest everyone in the organization writes one that explains how you work, what your needs are. And that can be shared with managers, with colleagues, depending on the organization you work in and the comfort and comfortability of an individual, perhaps with clients or service users. Anyone who has done a Fearless Futures program will know that this sounds like an equality measure because I'm saying everyone should do these. But the reason I think everyone should do them, I'll explain. It gets us closer to being able to design equity specifically for neurodivergent folks when everyone is engaged in this process. So why do I think that something that everyone does can create equity for neurodivergent colleagues? Well, there's a couple of reasons that I really love a Work With Me guide. First of all, by having a policy in place where we all are invited as colleagues in an organization to share our ways of working, our ways of communicating, our ways of processing information, we're actually then minimizing this pressure on folks who are neurodivergent to share their specific access needs live in the moment with others. That can be very distressing and burdensome when we think about the harmful narratives that exist about neurodivergent people. So by having this Work With Me guide in place that everyone writes one, we actually minimize that burden on neurodivergent colleagues. We're also defaulting the assumption that we spoke about earlier, right, Sarah, that there's a normal way of being, of thinking, of doing, a normal way of working. If we are all sharing information about if we are all sharing, information about how we process, how we communicate, we're helping to shift this discourse, this culture, to recognize that, yes, neurodiversity is a fact of human life. There isn't one way of working. And we all have a responsibility to one another to think about how our needs come together. I would say that when we are designing a Work With Me guide, these shouldn't be a sort of, you write it in 2023 and in 2027, you're expected to be in the exact same place with the exact same needs. We know that's not the case for people. So we would encourage these to be living, dynamic documents that people come back to and regularly engage in. So I'm going to hand back to you in a second, but I just want to show our audience some example areas of what a Work With Me guide can look like. So I'm going to share another slide with some example areas. So a Work With Me guide template might include sharing the method, the medium, or the style of communication that you deliver and that you prefer. A written, verbal style of communication. Do you prefer Zoom or email? Another one might be, what's the best way to share information with you? Or you might ask, how do you process information? Our preferences for giving and receiving feedback, how we approach conflict, and also really kind of material nuts and bolts parts of our working lives, the details of your usual working schedule, and the things that you need to know about working with me. These create space for folks to share their needs, and then for us as colleagues to engage with what someone has decided they want to communicate with us. So it's an aid for managers, for line managers, for colleagues across teams, and can really support us to get away from this pathology paradigm that sets up this normal and abnormal binary. I'm going to stop sharing now. Folks, you've listened to my voice for a long time, and I hope lots of that was useful for you. But Sarah, we spend a lot of our time talking about the practical application of the models, like the social model. So beyond the Work With Me guide, what else can folks do in terms of the practical solutioning for neurodivergent people?
I just want to go back to the Work With Me guide, because when you were showing that, Ruby, it really made me think about the journey we've been on as an organization with these guys, which we've had for a while. And I just want to share with everybody, firstly, because I think it's really important to do so, that these guides were not brought to us. We didn't create these guides. These were not brought to us by Fearless Futures, an amazing US organization called Spring Up, who we've worked with quite heavily. The amazing experts, Lee and Staz, brought these into our lives. So huge credit to them for that. And you should definitely check out Spring Up. These Work With Me guides, though, are so profound, so important, because they put the onus, as you said, Ruby, that social model, they put the onus back on us. It is for me to check my colleagues' Work With Me guides, to keep on top of them and changes that might be made before I start a new project with those colleagues, or before I have a meeting with those colleagues, however it works for me. And I think that's really, really important. And something you can even put into your systems. You might have a system of onboarding a project where you do have a stage of that, which is everybody reads each other's work with me guides before the first meeting to make sure we're aligned on all of our different ways in which we work and the different needs we have as well. So just double clicking on those work with me guides and how important they are, and that tailoring, that need that Ruby's spoken to. And when you saw the umbrella, you will have noticed this. Neurodivergent folks require that tailoring because their lived experiences, their bodies and minds are different. And so it's really important we honor that. I'm coming back to the point I made earlier. There is no single neurodivergent experience. I'm trying to think, what is my most important? There's so many things in mind. My most important thing, I think for me, it's what are we valuing in our organization? So really interrogating that. And maybe, let me put it more simply, how do people get promoted? How do people succeed in our organization? Because I think something that is really important, the first step in this is, for neurodivergent folks, for all of our employees, we need to make sure that there is really clear in black and white somewhere codification of what it takes to get from point A to point B, from senior manager to director. That's just good practice, right? We all know that. It needs to be really clear in writing for people, because I say this all the time, so if you've been to any of my workshops or any other webinars, you'll have heard me say this. It's in the space of subjectivity that a lot of inequity and oppression can thrive. We need to create really codified rubrics and kind of guides as to what success looks like in our organization. If we just leave that up to line managers to make those decisions day in, day out off their own interpretations and ways of understanding success, we are ultimately more likely to prioritize and preference neurotypical folks in our organization, because we know that our society is built in a way that already preferences them and positions, as Ruby spoke to, neurotypical ways of doing things as better, as more useful. So we need to reject that by creating really clear, black and white, codified, this is what it takes to be promoted. And going even further into this, I think the one thing that you spoke to, Ruby, that I think is really profound is when you were speaking about flexibility, this came to the fore. For some neurodivergent folks, their process, how they get to from the point of starting something to the point of producing an output, product, whatever it might be in your organization, their process may be quite different to the process of other people in your organization. Neurotypical folks may be different to what you expect. It's the process we need to be really clear on. What we're not saying is that our neurodivergent colleagues cannot achieve and create the things that everybody else can. They absolutely can. But what we're saying is, for certain neurodivergent folks, they may take a different process to doing that. And so what I think is really, really useful is to look at what we value, what is needed to be promoted, and ask ourselves, how much of this is process and how much of it is output? Because chances are, if it's process and we're judging people on the how of doing things in our organization, it's likely to preference neurotypical folks. So how far can we change for certain folks in our organization our understanding of success, so that it's not just following this linear process of how we've always done things, but maybe it's like, actually, there's flexibility in how you do it. What we're going to focus on for success and what we value, and therefore how we judge you, is the output, the quality of the output over the process. I think that's really, really important, because what we're saying here is different people will have different processes to get there. And that can be really hard, because in all of our organizations, there's the way things have always been done, the way that things have always been done. And to some extent, quite often, and we all fall foul of this, it's really normal and we have to reject it. Often we have this natural kind of way of seeing the way things have always been done, the process, which is often preferential to neurotypical folks, seeing it as superior. But that's the good way of doing things. That's the best way of doing things. Really consistently interrogate, is it the best way of doing things? Or is it just how we've always done it before? And that therefore makes it easier for us as line managers, as leaders, to judge other people by that. Because it would take greater energy, greater kind of creativity to suggest that there might be multiple ways of doing these things, but actually what we're focused on is the output. So to summarize there, because I've said a lot, but I think for me, what's really important is practically for our neurodivergent colleagues looking at what do we value, and more specifically, what does it take to get promoted? And doing two things, codifying that, making sure it lives somewhere and it's so clear, and it's not just down to individual line managers to make those decisions. There's somewhere really clear that going from this level to this level is articulated. And number two, that we try to shift what we value away from the how to the what. So we are creating more room in our organizations for different processes to get there, which I think is so, so important. Ruby, there's something else that's just jumping into my mind that I'm just going to put out there, because I think this came up actually when you were talking about some of the measures we will need to put in place in our organizations for our neurodivergent colleagues. And it kind of actually links back to what we said at the very beginning as well about the social model, which is sometimes, folks, for our neurodivergent colleagues, we need to spend money, whether it's because we need to get this software to support them or this equipment to support them, etc. When we are spending money, there needs to be a shift in our paradigm of how we think about this, because quite often when we're spending resource on folks in our organization, it's seen as an accommodation. It's seen as something nice we're doing to help them, extra money that's being spent on them. But if we understand our workplaces as already built in such a way that they preference neurotypical folks, our systems, the infrastructure of our organizations are already built, we already invested in creating them in a way that preference one group of people, then actually, when we are spending money investing in infrastructure to support our neurodivergent colleagues, we're not spending extra money. We're redirecting resources because we already over-invested in only one community. I really want to impress that point on everybody today. When you are talking and getting buy-in in your organization for spending resource, spending money and time to create the infrastructure to break down the barriers for neurodivergent folks, the language you want to use is, we are redirecting resource because we've over invested in another community. It's really important that we think about it that way, because otherwise we create dynamics in our organization of, I'm just going to put it bluntly, charity, as though we've done this out of the goodness of our heart, rather than we've done it because our organization wasn't set up in the first place. When we invested in the setup of XYZ process, it wasn't with certain people at the center of it. I think that's extremely important. So I've given you loads there, but I just want to distill that down. Let's change the language we use around investment and support for neurodivergent employees so that we can be really clear on what we're doing there and not set up power dynamics of needing gratitude or so on, which is not helpful and quite damaging in our organizations. And number two, that other piece that for me is so important, what are we valuing in promotions processes, in leadership? And can we really interrogate that and really look at, okay, first let's have a set rubric for promotion. And secondly, let's make sure it's not always about process and everyone following the same processes, but about outputs, and give people greater flexibility as to how they get to those outputs. And I think, Ruby, I know I've gone so deep on this, but I think one thing I do just want to underline is leadership as well. How we define leadership in our organizations. I think you and I have spoken about this before, actually, is so heavily connected to neurotypical ways of being and doing. And I want to think about things like, for instance, what types of ways of showing up do we expect from leaders? Quite often we do expect, I see so many organizations, and I know many of us will have fallen foul of this, seeing leaders as people who are very highly verbal, extremely confident in commanding space with many other people, etc., etc. Who has access to those ways of being? And for which neurodivergent folks might those be harder to access? Are there other ways of being a leader? I don't actually think this is just about, when I say that, I could do a whole other webinar, folks, on this. It's not even just about neurodivergence. There's so many different inequities that show up in this way. How are we defining leadership? I'm constantly interrogating that, because the ways that we define leadership quite heavily are deeply connected to neurotypicality. I'm going to stop talking there and pass the baton back to you, Rube.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. I mean, yeah, I think you've given our audience really a lot to take away from that, and taking us to that point of thinking about leadership for me was very connected to the points that you raised for us around codifying expectations, because the way that we define, often implicitly, leadership correlates to what we understand excellence to look like in our organization. And it's so often around process, right? I think about how many job descriptions I've seen, either as an applicant or working with clients through consulting and looking at how we can make their recruitment processes more equitable. And we have this bullet point, excellent communication. And I ask clients, well, first of all, what does that look like to you? And talk to me about why that's critical to the execution of this role. And so I promise you 9 times out of 10, people are like, well, I just think you kind of have to be good with people. And we really need to interrogate these ideas of excellence that are so much about process and actually are telling us about this prioritization of neurotypicality, rather than telling us about how a job actually needs to be done to deliver the role brilliantly. So love that you brought that to the fore for us, and it's very connected to leadership. Something that came to me, and I think this is a tricky area when it comes to equity, anti-disableist thinking and equity for neurodivergent people in our orgs, is if I think about, we've all done our work with Me Guides in our organization. We've gone out to Lee and Stas, we've got a template, it's embedded in our systems, and perhaps we're working with a group of colleagues on a project. And we notice that there's actually a couple of needs that are articulated by different people that seem to clash. They don't seem to be able to kind of mesh together such that people can work together. Perhaps a line manager has a new report and the line manager has particular access needs. Perhaps the line manager is autistic and their report perhaps has an executive functioning disorder. And how they've articulated their needs, we can see that there's something perhaps difficult about how those two can both be met. So when there is a clash of access needs, Sarah, how do we work through this? Because this does happen. We need to be realistic about the fact that it happens. I think sometimes it feels really sticky and scary. So people kind of go, I don't know what to do with that. And it becomes a hot potato. So I'd love if you could talk to us about how do we approach this courageously and with equity at the core.
I love that you've brought that in right at the end. It's huge. No, I'm so excited by it. Let me see if I can do it justice in the time we have before we go to Q&A. Can I just say, folks, this is something you won't hear that much about. And I do think, as you said, Ruby, there is a bit of a fear about talking about the fact that sometimes access needs clash. And I think that fear comes from a really valid place of, firstly, it brings up a lot of complexity. But secondly, it's difficult because when things clash, we have to make a decision about where we go. And we really don't want to deprioritize anybody. That is not inclusive. But of course, we need a way forward. A caveat I want to say before I say this is that when we're talking about different access needs clashing, that is no way the fault of individual folks. For instance, in this example, individual neurodivergent folks. And it doesn't therefore mean that, oh, well, your needs clash, we can't do anything about it. That's the most dangerous route we can go down. And I know nobody joining us this morning, I know or hope would even respond in that way. But we're not saying the fault is with those people for bringing those access needs to the fore. Because as we said at the beginning, in a social model, it's on us to break down the barriers as an organization, as leaders, as managers. First thing that is so important when two access needs clash is that we actually state that clash, that we are honest that a clash is happening. What we don't want to do, and I see this in a lot of organizations and I understand the rationale, is pretend that's not the case. Let's start with the place, and this is the case with so much anti-oppression DEI work. Let's start from the place of articulating it. We're seeing a clash between these. Maybe one neurodivergent person really requires verbal processing, but another neurodivergent person really requires written processing. And they're working really closely together on a project. And these are needs that they've both stated. How do we move forward there? First, let's state it. We're seeing a needs clash here, not across the entire team, for example, but with these folks and with anybody that it's relevant to. Again, as I said, stating this isn't a problem with you, but this is something about how we're all going to work together that we need to iron out so that we can all work really productively together. The second step after we've articulated it is to work out whether the needs are reconcilable. 9 times out of 10, needs are reconcilable. We've just got to get creative. Okay, so this person requires written processing in our kind of meetings. This person requires verbal processing. So what we're going to do for all of our meetings in this project is we're going to create a short pre-read for every single meeting. The pre-read will have a template for it. Everyone fills it in so that some people can do their written processing before they come into the meeting. Other people can verbally process through the meeting together. We have different ways of doing it. Those things become reconcilable. Or we could say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to use written processing throughout our project in our project reports. But for folks that require verbal processing, we will buy in software that is verbal to written conversion so they can speak into equipment and that conversion can be done for them. So they don't need to invest in that extra work of doing the verbal processing and then doing the written processing. These things are reconcilable if we take the time. But not all needs will always be reconcilable. And I have to be honest about that. It's very, very rare. Sometimes it happens that there is a clash. And that clash is so kind of the extremity of the clash or the kind of severity of it means we can't move forward with a single approach. And even when we're trying to reconcile with extra support put in place, it's still not possible. I'm taking you into a really abstract place here, folks, so stay with me. But when that's the case, where do we fall? Whose needs do we prioritize? In those moments, we have to ask ourselves, what is essential for the work that we do in the world? I don't know. You might produce razor blades in the world. I'm just going totally off my head. You might run reading projects in certain parts of the country. Whatever it is that you do, what is the most important thing for the productivity and the outcomes of this project? But the 2 questions you have to ask yourself when you make that decision are, am I making this decision because it's the status quo? Am I actually disguising it as the business need, what the project or the work we're doing needs, but really it's just the way we've always done things? Question number 1. And question number 2, does this happen to be a way of doing things that preferences neurotypical folks? Is there another way of doing it? And so I think when access needs clash, if I can just summarize, 9 times out of 10, it simply requires you to do that extra thinking, which is not charity, it's the extra thinking you have to do because you already overinvested in certain folks to ensure that you can reconcile those 2 needs. And it might mean that some of us have to do extra work, right? I've got to write a pre-read before my meeting because that makes sure that I can bring everybody into the meeting. And if we really can't see a way forward, these needs aren't, I cannot see a way of reconciling them, I look at what my organizational need is, prioritizing that, but I always ask myself the question, am I just going with what's the status quo, how we've always done it? Am I positioning neurotypical ways of doing things as better without questioning that? So that I could go on and on needs clashes, but I'm aware that we have had lots and lots of questions coming up, I think from like minute two of this webinar, which I've never seen. So you are an amazing group. You can come back, you lot. I like this a lot. There's so much brilliance here. A reminder before we go into the Q&A that everything that me and Ruby have said, because some of this has been really, really complex, everything is recorded, so you can come back to it again and again should you want to or need to, and I really hope that you do. Ruby, we're going to go into some questions. Are you I want to give this lots of time.
I'm nearly ready.
Right,
yeah, well, what I would love to do is let's take a couple of minutes to go in and harvest some of your questions, because folks, there is many, and whilst Sarah and I do that, we're going to give you a link to our feedback survey and give you a couple of minutes if you would like to and are feeling generous to give us your feedback. It's super short. What worked for you? What didn't work? What would you like to see more of? I'm going to drop the link into the chat, and Sarah and I will be quiet and give you 2 minutes to go and tick some boxes for us. And if you have more feedback that you'd like to share, feel free to continue whilst we're moving through the questions, or just keep the link open and you can come back to it once this webinar ends. So Sarah and I are going to be quiet for 2 minutes. We're going to go and look at your questions, and then we'll be back for the Q&A.
Ruby said we're going to be quiet, so I've been told, folks, I'm going to be quiet. 2 minutes, we'll be back.
Hi, folks. Just a reminder, the feedback link is in the chat for you. Invitation to click and open that now, because once we end the webinar, it will disappear. Sarah and I are going to start answering some of your questions because there are so many brilliant questions and we want to get through as many as we can. But if you haven't given us your feedback yet and you would like to, just keep that tab open and do come back to it. Sarah, should we jump in?
I think I'm so excited, folks. You've given us so much. I don't really know where to start. I'm highlighting all of them as things I want to talk about right now. So Ruby, you start us off. Which question would you like to respond to? Are we being very fair and starting with the first one?
Yeah, I think that's probably, I mean, there's so many. Let's start with the first one that came in. Some countries in the EU and beyond don't see neurodiversity as disability. So some employees there bristle at being lumped in with disability work. How do you include everyone in the umbrella even if they don't personally identify, and may actively oppose efforts due to the label? Big question. For me, there's two parts to this question. I'm happy to start us off, Sarah. Feel free.
Go for it. I've got lots of thoughts as well. Over to you.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is at Fearless Futures, we don't find legalistic frameworks are often as expansive as we need them to be when it comes to equity and inclusion work. We're not necessarily saying that you should go and be in opposition to the legal framework in any given country that you're working in, but more so that it is often the case that we do need to be more expansive, because legal frameworks like the Equalities Act in the UK are not specific enough. They're not rooted in rigorous anti-oppression thinking that we need them to be. So where you might find that neurodivergence isn't included in how disability is understood within a legal framework, we would say use the social model of disability that tells us that there are particular ideas of normalcy, normal minds and normal bodies, and there are people whose minds and bodies do not align, and there are barriers in place in society because of this idea of normalcy that's prioritized. When we use the social model, we're rooting our anti-disablism in a much more robust framework. So I would definitely encourage folks to use the models that have been designed by disability advocates for us. They are the best guides that we can have. Second part of the question, Sarah, do you want to take this? How do you include everyone in the umbrella, even if they don't personally identify and may actively oppose the efforts due to the label? It's a really, really valid question.
Yeah, and the first thing I want to say is, as I said earlier, I just want to reinforce this. Not all neurodivergent folk will understand their identity, their lived experience as one of disability, and that is extremely important. People with mental ill health may not understand their mental ill health as disability. And of course, the reason why, and you've put it here exactly, the reason why disablism comes into the conversation is often the legal route to kind of have a court case based on discrimination is via the term disability as a protected characteristic, right? So that's why it comes in. But just because that's the route that certain people can use to get legal representation doesn't mean that we should say, therefore, we're going to put that onto you. All of you folks are disabled, because that doesn't work for some people, and it doesn't define their identity. I just want to be clear as well that there will be people with mobility impairments, visual impairments, etc., that may choose not to use the language of disability as well. So you have to be really careful that we're not imposing language on other people, whilst also recognizing that that is the language that's used in many jurisdictions in the law to represent them. So that's a distinction we have to be clear on. The message I give to everybody when doing anti-oppression work is the language we use in reference to people, and therefore in reference to the measures we're putting in place, firstly, should be how people define themselves. So if people in your organization, say for instance, you have a neurodiversity network or a neurodiversity ERG, and they refer to themselves, for instance, as neurodiverse and not neurodivergent, for instance, as we're advocating for here, then you should use the language they use for their lived experience. One of the most important things here is that we always give people the agency to define who they are in the world and how they understand their lived experience. No one else should do that for them. So firstly, always be led by communities within your organization. But if people have different ways of identifying within your organizational communities and different language they may use to define it, then the question for me then becomes how far we need to use language to define the experience, and instead how far we want to use language to define the solutions. Here's what I'm talking about here. If you're then like, well, some people in my organization refer to themselves as neurodiverse, some people refer to themselves as neurodivergent, some people refer to themselves as disabled people, then I would shift your focus anyway away from what is the language for the lived experience to what's the language for solutions? when we are building solutions in our organization for the inherent anti-disablism or the barriers to neurodivergent folk, we're using an inclusion and equity lens. So instead, we might just use the language of, we are building inclusion for all people and the different ways that their bodies and minds function. Right? So what we're saying there is we're not using any specific language, we're talking about equity. Actually, we're focused on equity rather than we're focused on this particular struggle, because that might not define it for everybody. But also we have to be honest with people, and this is something I say a lot to leaders, that when we're using language, it cannot always be precise. So something I like to use is, we're using imprecise language for categorical clarity. Categorical clarity, that's a fancy way of saying, because we need to be able to talk about a specific community. So we're using imprecise language for categorical clarity here. So we're saying we understand it's imprecise. We've got to be honest as well that language evolves over time, and we have to be really clear about that. And that's not just in reference to the community we're talking about today, that's in reference to many marginalized communities. Language evolves and it changes, and different people have different relationships to language. So when we're using language, we need to always caveat what we're saying with that. We're not using this language, only this language, because we believe it's the only right language. We're using it for categorical clarity, so we can talk about a community together and have a shorthand for that. I've said lots there. You can tell that was an exciting question to me when it came in. Thank you to whoever sent that question in. Ruby, where do you want to go next?
Gosh, how long do we have left? Okay, not very long. So I think one of the questions that I'd love to touch on, there's a few questions around the Work With Me guide. Whilst I'm responding to this, Sarah, I'd love if you could share a link in the chat for folks and make sure you select everyone for Spring Up, because I know a couple of people have asked for Lily and Staz's contact details. One of the questions that's come up is, isn't the Work With Me guide making unnecessary? Everyone I might not work with aware of something I do not feel comfortable with. Sorry, that took me a second to get my head around. Is the Work With Me guide making unnecessary everyone I might not work with aware of something I don't feel comfortable with? So the thing about a Work With Me guide is it's an opportunity for people to share whatever they feel comfortable with. So rather than saying, it's kind of off the back of what Sarah was saying, rather than saying, if you are a person who has this condition, our organization understands that you are disabled, there's a box that says, explain your disability, and you must write that there, right? We would never advocate that there is a kind of prescriptive idea around what needs to go in a Work With Me guide. The point is to create space for people to share whatever they want their colleagues to know in order to work with them best. So one of the examples I shared was a question that says, and I think this is one that comes from the Spring Up guide that we first used at Fearless Futures, is things you need to know about working with, things you need to know about me for working with me. That's a really open question where someone might choose to share that they are neurodivergent. Maybe they want to tell people that they have CPTSD, or they want to tell people that I have Tourette's. This is how it shows up. This is how it can be difficult for me to engage in meetings when people engage in a particular way. Or you might share something completely unrelated, right? People might choose that area to share that they have a young child who needs their care and attention early in the morning, and they are most responsive from 10 o'clock, right? So it's an opportunity for people to share whatever is important for them. And it might be parts of themselves related to their neurodivergence, or it might not. And I think what's key is that we're not creating expectation that people sort of have to disclose things that they're not comfortable disclosing, but rather that there's an opportunity to share what feels comfortable for you. And we then take the pressure out of people having to share what might feel like essential information for their working lives, live, in the moment, multiple times with multiple colleagues, because that can be a really stressful experience. that's only being burdened on folks who are neurodivergent. So I hope that's helpful, and thank you so much for your question. So we have a few more minutes. I didn't invite you into that question. Did you want to add anything?
I actually wanted to add to it because we had another question that was quite similar, but was around how do we encourage people to be open and honest when they know how their needs are likely to be perceived in the society, which I think is really connected to that. So on the one hand, we're using these really open questions that people can share as much or as little as they want to in the terms that work for them. But also, how do we encourage people to share that? Because of course, in an organization that is deeply anti-oppressive, deeply equitable, what we're always doing is creating a culture where people feel if they do share this, people will know how to respond effectively. And so I think, to be really honest on that piece, folks, people will not share with you when it comes to neurodivergence, particularly certain ways of being in the world, so ways of bodies and minds operate, unless they feel you understand it, and critically that they're not going to be stigmatized for it, that they're not going to be punished for it. And so these Work With Me guides are one thing you can scale, you can put into your organizations, but they won't work on their own. What you need to invest in, it comes as no surprise when it's me saying it, does it? You need to invest in education. People are not going to share with you, for example, that they have ADHD if they fundamentally don't think you would understand what that is, and think that they're, ADHD just means, X or Y. And that's even more the case, folks, to be quite honest, with certain neurodivergence. So when we think about certain neurodivergence that has been depicted for such a long time in the media as actually really scary and really extremely different, people know that. People living with this neurodivergence, they know how this particular aspect of their identity has been depicted in films, has been depicted in television, has been depicted. And so their concern is that they share that with you and you're like, oh, if somebody has obsessive compulsive disorder, their greatest concern is potentially going to be, well, I share that with you and you think I just need to have everything in my fridge in a straight line, right? But is that really what their life is? Somebody may well be scared, I have schizophrenia. If I share that with you, you're going to assume certain things about how I might behave towards you because you've seen that depicted in the media and so on. So we've got to be honest here about two things. One, we need to use education to build trust. So people are like, okay, I know my colleagues have some foundational understanding here. It doesn't have to be education programs. It doesn't have to be hours and hours in the classroom. Articles, reading groups, podcasts, a self-led area in your cloud or drive that people can go into and read up on certain things. That means that the resources are there if people want to engage with them. You need to make sure that education is there. And you need to be honest that there are certain elements of neurodivergence that are much harder for people to talk about. Of all neurodivergence, they're much harder for people to talk about. And there are also ways of being neurodivergent that are also extremely, always, I think, are stigmatized in our society, all of them. But there is a spectrum here, and we definitely have to be honest that certain ways of being that people may express, they can be very concerned about how that's read. And this comes back to what I said earlier about leadership and what we value. If we change the language around that and we make it extremely clear that it's not process, it's outcome, it therefore takes that pressure off people as well. But I wanted to be honest with you, because I know so many questions are about the Work With Me guides, which are incredible, but they don't work on their own, because either people won't share very much in them, or people will be very scared of them, and it will take, there'll be all sorts of emotional work they have to do to produce that, which is not what you want. So there's something here about ensuring that people have some level of trust. They can't have absolute trust, none of us can. Some level of trust that their colleagues have some foundational understanding or access to foundational understanding.
Love that. Sorry, thank you so much. I'm really sadly aware of time.
No.
And I feel like I want to say, before I say anything else, that we tried to get through as many of your questions as we could, but there are so many wonderful questions that we didn't get to answer. A lot of them to do with specific kind of areas of policy building or rebuilding, education within your organizations, which is really, really exciting. If there's anything you asked that we didn't get to answer, please reach out to us, Sarah@fearlessfutures.org and Ruby@fearlessfutures.org, and we will endeavour to come back to you with an answer that will be really useful. Additionally, if there's anything else that you didn't ask but that comes to you that you'd like to talk to us about, please do reach out, and we would love to connect with you after our webinar ends.
Thank you so much, folks, for joining us, for giving us this time this morning. Stay in touch. Tell us where you take this learning. We've got another webinar. I'm going to be there again, folks. You're going to have had enough of me next week with our amazing Chief Relationships Officer, Sable Lomax, as well. So join us next week if you can. Otherwise, have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks for joining us, folks.
Thanks, folks. Take care.